Welcome everyone to this week's IPLD sync meeting. It's Monday, February the 22nd, 2021. And as every week, we go briefly over the stuff that we've done and work on next week, and then discuss any agenda items we might have. I start with myself. I currently work on getting the JS IPFS implementation using the JS multi-formats stuff. And kind of like as a first step, what I do is I try to get the Unix FS using the new DAG protocol buffers codec that Rod was doing. And so Unix FS, like this part was unexpectedly easy, but the problem is now integrating into IPFS because JS IPFS is of course using internally IPLD, and of course the whole IPLD thing that we currently have is using the old CID, the old codecs, and so on. So yeah, this just doesn't work well together. So so the idea is what I currently try to do, and then I will see if it's a good idea, is that also internally, instead of using this kind of like IPLD repo that we had, it's using the repo or block service, it's a minor detail, directly, and it's just using the codecs directly, encodes them, decodes them, and then puts them directly into the store. So there's not really like something in between anymore. And this way, I should be able to use the DAG protocol buffers for the Unix FS parts directly, and everything will be fine, but there will still be like the whole DAG API will still use the old stuff and so on. And yeah, we'll see how this turns out. But the first step, I want to get Unix FS working, because like this is really like kind of like the core of what IPFS, at least for me, is doing. And it would be already a great step forward to having those using the new libraries that we want to also people to use in their JavaScript ecosystem. And this is what I'm continue to do over the next few weeks. Next is Daniel.
Cool. So something that has finally started to shape up is I don't want to call it version 2 of encoding JSON, but it is kind of that. It's an experiment to write a new implementation of JSON for Go. I've been working on this with a couple of other people for a few months, and we did want to open source it eventually. So we're not fully there yet because we don't want to draw too much attention, but there is a public snapshot now on GitHub, and it's importable as a Go module. So if anybody wants to play with it, right now it's a full token encoder and decoder. So that means you can do fairly low-level things, which I think are going to be interesting mainly for things like DAG JSON and Go. But also, for example, Quick Go has a logger in JSON that has to be really fast. And right now, it generates a ton of code with an external library. And I think that could be like 50 lines with this new token encoder. And it's going to keep improving. So you can follow that repo if you want. It's just an FYI for now. And the other thing that I'm working on is essentially our first project in the new team is using IPLD prime in IPFS. So the design part that I'm picking up is the node modifications in the API in Go Merkle DAG, which is what a lot of the IPFS packages use. So I've linked to a hackmd where we're collecting all the modules and packages that use these APIs and interact with them. And I'll probably have to sync with Eric on this because I think he's been designing similar APIs for modifying and navigating nodes. I think they're called the transform APIs. Might be wrong there. But I want to talk to him because, essentially I should decide, do I want to reuse his work there if it's close to being ready, or do I want to do something simpler in Go Merkle DAG directly or something like that? And that's it for me.
Thanks. Next on my list is Will.
Sure. So I'm also part of this group with Daniel that's looking at applying IPLD and the IPLD prime into IPFS. And we're still I think, coming to terms with what we're chewing off in that project. There's a lot of cruft, whereas we look at each new Git repository, we're like, oh, that's still using GX. There's a lot that could be done that's low hanging in that one. So there's some design work, as Dan mentioned, that a lot of this is figuring out how to map what's currently called a DAG service that combines a few different things, including the concept of how you fetch data served generically, but also how you add and remove data to your local data store, which is somewhat of a separate interface because it's not necessarily pulling from the network in the same way that fetching will both pull potentially from the network or potentially from your local data store. And then there's also a whole bunch of mutation and modification to DAGs and data. And so figuring out what the actual interfaces we want at the same time that we're moving from the IPLD format view of the world, where a IPLD format node is at a block level as opposed to a IPLD prime node, which is more granular and is a individual node in the way that we think of it today. Means that we then get to propagate stuff to a bunch of stuff. One of the unblocked ones that I'm hoping to get through this week is there's a bunch of additional codecs that IPFS is able to at least read from and think about in terms of data, including Git and tar. And so we should figure out how to take that same data and read it into IPLD prime nodes so that we can still have that work as we move to an IPLD prime view of the world. So I expect to hack up at least sort of the same level of functionality of being able to, from a Git on disk or a tar on disk, end up with IPLD prime node views of that same data. So that we're unblocked as we start moving to IPLD prime interfaces. And we will, I think, also end up posting a bunch of links in GitHub issues to help people follow along on this work. But the end view, ideally, is that additional IPLD codecs can make their way into IPFS much more easily, which hopefully makes our lives happier. That's it for me.
Thanks. Next one is Eric.
Oh boy, a lot of things happened in the last week, and I didn't keep a diary on the day by day, so I forgot most of them. But a couple of things that are interesting to this group. I did start looking at the new JSON stuff that MV Dan linked earlier, and it's cool. Surprise, surprise. So I'm going to be really excited if we can use that to make a better DAG JSON in the future. Something I've also been wondering about, and am still wondering about, is if we'll be able to use the token concept from that library to do other broader work, like use it as the foundation for DAG CBOR token handling. And I think that's probably a lot less likely at first glance. I'm going to keep thinking about that because the more, I mean, obviously the more that I can use, the happier that I am. But it's just meant to do JSON things, so it wouldn't be surprising if it's not super reusable. So it's possible that in the future I'll end up with like some codec utils stuff for DAG CBOR and DAG JSON shared, and then there'll be like this cutover where that starts using the token from the JSON libraries. We'll see. All that stuff that I'm also just looking at and not actually writing code on yet, because that's a whole endeavor and is not budgeted yet. Something I'd like to ask for input from other folks here on is, we've talked about cross-language fixtures before, and we've got some of them in some of our projects in some various formats. And I've started taking notes on that with a couple of examples of places where we're doing it already and thoughts about how that's working out, and some options for things I should think that we should look at going forward. Man, I'm forgetting how to speak English. So there's a PR with a bit of an exploration report going, and I would love comments on that. I've only got a handful of formats identified as possibly useful there so far. And so it's just things that I have heard of. And there might be more. So yeah, take a look at that. That's all.
Thanks. I can read that Peter doesn't have an update this week. And next one is Carson, who also doesn't really have an update, but if you, feel free to say something about your research.
Yeah, not much this week. Our team just came off a big research sprint, so there's not a lot of code progress of any kind in particular. There's some interesting research findings, which I could talk about, but it's a little tangential to the discussion here, so I'll leave that. Some work, so I met last week with PVH from Ink and Switch, and we had a chat about IPLD, because that crew has been kind of curious about, has been IPLD curious for a while. I think I convinced them to give it a try. So expect some questions from that spectrum of the internet soon. And the cooler thing on that front is that we've started to move forward with some proposals around some of the hash consistent sorted tree work that Michael told me about, but I think maybe Alex or somebody someone wrote that up. Anyway, so that's looking very promising for some thread syncing stuff that we're doing. So that's cool.
If you have documents from your research that you think would be reasonable for us to know about and like make discoverable, send us some links and I will slam those into the part of our repo that's called the exploration reports and just link to them from there. And
cool, okay. Where our team is actually starting to move, we're trying to do more of the research stuff in the open, like many people. So we've started to move stuff to GitHub discussions. And that's looking pretty good actually, as a way to get stuff out. So I could potentially link some of that once it's discussionable.
Yep. Yeah, my dream is just to have a big old link farm. I give up trying to police people on formats. There's no joy in that and very little productivity, but link collecting, yeah.
Cool, okay, nice. Anyway, that's it from me.
Thanks. Does anyone else have any updates before we go to the agenda items? Also feel free to edit agenda items. Cool. Then there is a question from Will about the distinction between Go codec DAG PB and Go IPLD Prime Proto. I guess that one is for Eric. What's the difference? The distinction?
That is actually not for me. I almost could have asked that question myself.
Okay, so does anyone else know? Okay, so I guess we'll
so maybe this is between Dan and Hannah, and we should figure out why we have what looks like two codecs that are both DAG PB for IPLD Prime. That both have been updated in the last month.
Cool. Then we will hear about it next week, I guess. Cool. So I have also like a question to you folks about the Go IPLD IPFS stuff. So the first one is about as you talked about manipulation, what's the plan with the IPFS object API? Because like that's something that we also have in JS IPFS, and it's kind of like it falls kind of into the IPLD world, but we always tell people don't use it. Like just don't use the object API because it will be deprecated hopefully eventually. So I just wonder like what the plan is there, because I would totally in favor of like either deprecating it or just like having for the use cases it has something better. And as I currently move JS IPFS to the new stuff, it also like kind of like doesn't make sense to move this old thing, or if you also think about should we move this old thing, it might make sense to discuss what are we going to do with this.
Yeah, so I talked with a dean earlier today, and he was open on the Go IPFS side at least to changing that interface, and said it felt like a weird awkward thing given where we are with IPFS prime, and that having maybe that merges with DAG, or maybe that we deprecate that in favor of DAG. Michael has something to say, it seems like.
So we're entering into like a real kind of status quo bias here. Like, I think that we should actually frame two questions and put them in GitHub issues and see if we can find any sufficient response. One for the objects API and one for the DAG API, and literally ask for anyone to defend it existing. Like, does anyone think that it is a good idea to still have these, and that it is not better to just use the block API and the other APIs? Like, is there a real defense of these things? Because we keep like pattering around, like maybe we deprecate it, maybe not, but like I haven't heard anyone in years really try to defend them. So like let's frame it that way, and then I think that by the end of it, it'll be really clear what we need to do. Or it won't. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe somebody has a really good reason that they need the DAG API or something, right? But if nobody can come up with one, like I think that it's a lot easier to close this out.
Yes, it
for having two of them, that sounds totally right. And even from a command line, like why are you interacting with structured data on this inherently weirdly sort of serialized command line thing? That also feels like this weird disjoint. You could totally see it would sure be nice over either the HTTP API or over your internal, like if I'm embedding as a library, I probably want like my IPLD DAG to be able to go in and out, right? And that is in some sense like a DAG interface.
That's not
what these things are.
Yeah, that's a great idea for an interface. Like we should build something like that. That's not what the DAG API is. The DAG API is like a really bad JSON API for for creating block data with different codecs. Like it's just you can always design a better experience by just having the codec in the client and using the block API than you can using the DAG API. And they're basically kind of one-to-one. Like there's no like additional important feature essentially that the DAG API gets. There's no special treatment or improvements there. So like, yeah, what you described is it sounds like a useful thing. It's just not what we have.
Yeah, so
so we should think about where these move to, but like that seems in some sense like the natural thing. Like there's this very well used and trodden block thing that a lot of people are using. But if we've got IPLD prime, we might also expose it. Like it sure seems useful to expose the actual IPLD nodes, right? As the thing that is like the natural thing to work with. So,
yeah.
But we need to figure out how we end up there.
Yeah, so I've also talked with Gosala about it on the JavaScript side of things, that he also said basically, yeah, so he would want to, either move things into the block API or having a separate API, but also, so we had the same discussion about, does the DAG API make sense? Does the object API make sense? And just, yeah. But anyway, so it's good to hear that basically both sides, like the Go side and the JavaScript side, says we need more discussions and figure something out. And I think the idea from Michael is good, because I also have the impression, because like if someone had questions about it, or I always told people, don't use the DAG API, don't use the objects API. And I guess like many of us did this in the past few years. So hopefully people just don't use it. But I also can't tell. Like it could totally be that people use those APIs. I don't know. Cool. Yes. So how do we move forward? Like, who is the owner of those, like opening those issues or get the discussion started?
I gave myself an action item to file issues for
cool.
both of those.
Yep.
I think final decision is probably on Stephen, frankly. Yeah.
Yeah, but still, like Go was that someone currently owns it to make this move forward, and so this will be well. That's great. Thanks. Yeah, and please, also then CC me so I can then also ping the other people from the JS side and get this moving. Okay, cool. That's great. Okay. And the other question is kind of related. Is there so as you were talking about more codecs, I guess there's currently also an Ethereum codec for IPLD, I guess, in Go. Is there? Or is it only a JavaScript thing to traverse Ethereum blockchain data?
I'm not aware of one.
We might have lots of code floating around somewhere on the internet. I think if it's currently linked in Go IPFS, then is it guaranteed to have been maintained even up until the present date is very questionable. And so I would say it's going to remain however maintained it has been, which is to say, I really don't know.
Yeah, so it's
yeah, so there's actually been some developments there. Like this is a bit in flux. I think that the Vulcanize, I think it was the Vulcanize folks, like they just did a whole big document on Ethereum and IPLD, which I believe had recommendations for slight modifications to the way that we did it, or perhaps had just like normalized to something that Rod had done before. But I think that we have like better documentation at least on that now, and I think there is a proposal for them to do some grant work around this, which may end up including either new versions of those, which may end up including new versions of those. In fact, one of the things they brought up that they need is an IPLD prime version of a bunch of these codecs. And so I think that we may actually be funding a grant for them to do that, but I'm not 100% on where that landed. Because there's a few different grants that we have with them, and I don't know like what the staging of them is.
Yeah, so the background for this question was there is a JavaScript codec for Ethereum, which is insanely outdated. And so I'm not even sure it works. So it was basically written before even I joined Protocol Labs. And I'm the official maintainer, but I know almost nothing about Ethereum. So it was kind of like just like, basically keep it working, whatever it did, but I don't know even what it did. So therefore, so I would certainly not move. So I don't want to create a new codec for the new JS multi-format stuff. So I was basically just wondering if we care, for example, about like feature parity between Go and JavaScript and so on, about those things that, so in my opinion, if someone wants to use Ethereum with JS IPFS, they just should start from scratch. Like that's just the honest answer, because you can't just build on top of the stuff that we currently have. And so I would rather deprecate it or remove it from JS IPFS. And then, yeah, I was just wondering what the Go side is doing, or like what we have there. And yeah.
Yep. I think that's basically the same story in Go right now. We have libraries.
I don't think I see a codec that we are officially supporting to upgrade to Prime. So we're not planning to do any Ethereum codec work as part of this project, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. Then, so then for me, the action item will be that I talk to the JavaScript side of IPFS and talk about like what is our plan if we redo the upgrade to JS multi-formats. Like, do we take the chance to say, okay, we don't maintain those codecs anymore, or stuff like this?
Yeah, given that it's not necessarily even going to work in Prime pretty soon, like I think that we can probably take it off of your plate and not include it in this upgrade. But Rod, I don't know how in the loop you are going to stay in your new role with the Vulcanize people and the PMs over there that are doing that. But we should at least get word to them that the JavaScript side of this also needs some love, and potentially, maybe there's another grant that Vulcanize wants to do if they have some JS engineers.
Yeah, I don't think that's at all in their path to what they need. But I guess if they're keen for grant money, then sure.
Yeah, and I mean, just like making sure that the PMs over there on the ecosystem side know that there is a hole here on the JavaScript side, that they can at least be on the lookout for people that might be able to fill it given time.
Something that's already probably a little bit of good news from what the Vulcanize people are proposing and working on is that they've started writing nice schemas for the way that they're transforming this data. And so if we do in the future look forward to having somebody take on JavaScript fresh implementations of Ethereum stuff, then that'll probably be a huge help in making sure that the implementations are actually aligned.
All right. Yeah, so those were my questions, or my agenda items. Is there anything else? I don't see anything on the agenda. Any other comments or things? Or do we, for example, want Carson to talk a bit about the research in case you would be open to, or I don't know. Or do we just close the meeting?
Okay, I have a question, and don't laugh at me when I ask this. But I was talking about hash authenticated data structures to someone in healthcare, and they're like, brought the question, what about a collision between two data items? How do you deal with that? And I've always kind of answered, I just trust the math nerds on this, but that doesn't quite fly so well. So I'm curious if you guys have a more structured answer or what about that?
Yeah, so I mean, if you do the math on the collisions, you can tell them sort of what the probability is. In practice, like a sufficient hash function, if you see a collision, it means that someone is attacking the algorithm. Like that's what that means. It means that like it's been compromised and they're going after your data. like literally. You won't really see, given the probability, you won't see natural collisions with a sufficient hash function. That's really the answer. If you're going to see if you were to see these just sort of randomly all of the time, then things like blockchains wouldn't actually function, right? Like it actually has to be insanely difficult to generate these collisions. Yeah.
And more practically, if we ever have a collision, we crash. Like there's panics and there's logs and everything stops until someone goes in and figures out what happened and changes the hash function so that doesn't happen anymore.
Whoa, hold on. So you're saying, so IPFS may crash, but IPLD would not because it doesn't know that kind of knowledge?
No. So this is like, again, like, assume that this didn't happen naturally, that it happened because there's an attack. There's going to be ways to put bits in that still look like valid data. So it's not going to crash when it's under attack. The only time that it would crash is if it was like expecting data to look a particular way and then it didn't because there was like a natural collision, which again is like, you know, you're more likely to be hit by lightning while being hit by a bus. Like,
Can I put in terms that your hosts will understand? Basically tell them that every single Bitcoin wallet is secured by the very same stuff. And the fact that there is no theft of Bitcoin like left and right means that this stuff actually works, because there are actually people out there trying to guess, you know, hashes to actual wallets, and they're not very successful. So that's your, you know, actual risk scenario.
So actually, I'm not quite following your logic there, Peter. I think and let me put a little bit of a healthcare twist on it. So if you have, I think the concern is that, you know, healthcare data has certain regulations around it being correct. And so if there was a collision, potentially data could be lost. And so I think that's their main kind of concern. And I'm not sure how, because I mean, theoretically, I could have two medical images, each which are different but create the same hash. Theoretically. Now, practically speaking, I agree with you guys, that won't happen. But I think when you talk about a super risk-averse person, I have to kind of address that in some way. So did I misunderstand what you're saying, Peter, or what do you think?
What my example is that there are people out there actively looking for collisions with an immense payout, and they're not successful. And your scenario is, oh, I'm just going to randomly have a collision without even looking for it. So that's basically my argument. It's the same like when they were starting the large LHC, they were asking the physicists like, oh, can it like explode? And they were like, well, theoretically it can like turn into a black hole, right? It's basically the same level of stuff.
I like what Daniel wrote. If that's true, then I can use that as an argument.
I mean, Cosmic Ray might set some red flags, but I would say that like the consistency guarantees that they're used to getting from writing this to hard drives, those are much more likely to there's those hard drives are much more likely to corrupt that data. In fact, like we know that there is like a definitive like corruption rate of these hard drives. Like it is just, yeah, it's more likely that that would corrupt than there would ever be a collision. It's more likely that you would have simultaneous corruption in multiple mirrors than it is that at the same time than it is that you would have like a hash function.
Yeah, I guess every SLA has a bunch of 9s on it, right? So it's kind of like if you are trusting a storage system with a certain number of 9s, and the chance of a hash collision has a lot more 9s behind it, then you're worrying about the wrong thing.
Yeah.
Just look up the probability of a collision in the hash function, and then convert that to 9s, and tell them it's like, you know, something like 400 9s or something, right? Like you can give it to them in those terms if you want, right?
Okay, that's helpful. I think that's the way I have to think about it, is the probability. There's lots of probabilities of errors, and this one is just, here's how it relates to other ones that you're worrying about. The way I thought I thought about it quickly on my feed. I basically said, oh, well, we'll just actually generate a hash using 2 different hash functions, and the probability of both of those colliding for the same piece of data is like impossible. So, but I don't know. I don't want to do that, but that's what I answered quickly. Anyway, okay. Thanks for the feedback.
This is one of those problems where probability becomes hard to visualize, and it's like the chessboard thing of, you know, there's more possible chess moves than you can make than, I don't know, atoms in the universe or whatever the stat is. Something ridiculous, but it's this thing where you've got this chessboard in front of you, and there's this probability statement about how you can't statistically produce all of the possible moves on this small chessboard in a reasonable set of outcomes, like in a measurable set of solutions, and that's really hard to imagine. But that's the kind of communicating you need to do here. Is, look, on the face of it, it sounds ridiculous, but the probability underlying all this stuff is so extreme that it's just, you know, unlikely to happen in your lifetime, that kind of thing. And if it does happen, then it's very likely a legitimate attack, like something against SHA-1.
Thanks.
Okay. Anything else? No. Cool. Then I close the meeting. And so thanks everyone for attending, and see you all next week again. Goodbye, everyone.